Good morning, everybody.
Hello, we're back.
We're back. So this is our episode 15. I think I'm keeping count accurately. Today, Dan and I are talking about contemplation. Um, Not only how a contemplative way of looking at things shapes how we're experiencing COVID-19, but also looking at the practice of contemplation through the lens of this pandemic.
Yes.
Uh, just to introduce myself, I'm Mark Van Steenwyk from the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
And I'm Daniel Wolpert from the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing.
And so, Dan can talk about contemplation because the word contemplation is in his organization's name.
Yes. Yeah, but Mark is actually going to start.
I'm going to start. The thing that's interesting, and feel free to chime in, everyone who's watching. I don't know,
Yes.
with questions or observations about spiritual practice. To me, I complain about this a lot on Facebook about how there's been a. This is how I'm going to start, Dan. Talking about like how I get grumpy about certain ways of understanding contemplation. The assumption that a lot of people have as this becomes more mainstream and used as medicine in the Western mode is that if you start talking about contemplation and this pandemic, it's about coping with stress. Like that's true. There's something to that, but that's not what I'm interested in exploring through this, but rather like the way we understand and perceive reality and take note of ourselves and what's happening around us during this time when suddenly we have more time. Maybe many of us have time that we're slowing down and don't know what to do with it, and we're also being bombarded with scary information. So taking stock of that and how you discern, how you move forward, how you engage the world, to me that's a spiritual question. It's not just a non-spiritual question.
Yeah, so contemplation really being more of a way of life than a tool for self-care.
Yes, which it's at least it is a tool for self-care, but it's more than a tool for self-care.
Yeah, way more than that.
Yeah, ideally. What, like, maybe you could share about what your spiritual practice is like as kind of a way of talking about this. It's a posture, it's a way of life, but there are practices that are kind of anchor points.
Well, yeah, there are a lot of practices. So, but I do think that emphasizing this way of life and also way of life in community. So that's the other big piece, right? That it's not an individualistic pursuit. Although again, this is something in our society that it's definitely being turned into.
Yeah.
So it's this stance to life, which basically is saying, I, as an individual human being, am experiencing a kind of delusional experience of life and relationship to life, and so I'm going to try through these processes of paying attention to become less delusional. Hey, Kathleen, good to see that you're here with us today. And so the practices, spiritual practices, right? Prayer practices. Mark mentioned discernment, which is one of the key activities of the contemplative life. These are all practices that help us to pay attention, right? To pay attention directly to reality using the faculty of our mind and the sensory data that which is the only way that we know about the world, is through our senses.
And to me, this is where it's interesting, this sort of paying attention piece, or giving attention, which to me is kind of at the core of it, and why I think contemplation is intrinsically political. Like you can't separate spheres like that, but it's political because how you perceive reality and how you give attention and how you prioritize what you give your attention to are political very often political in our society.
Yeah.
And so this idea of separating spirituality from politics, which of course Western society does. So like we treat it as self-care, we treat spirituality as self-care, and then politics is this other thing that you keep separate from contemplation, because politics is stressful. Contemplation is about peace,
Right.
namaste, kind of like
Right.
things,
I
right?
saw these posts yesterday. Can we just please not be political today and just focus on Easter? And I just thought, yeah, that's the essence of the problem right there.
Yes. Yeah.
Mark's brain has just frozen and
I mean,
turned into
that's
mush.
just a whole thing. Like, and I get, like, when people say the word political, they often mean partisan politics in the mode of two parties in the United States of America. Like, maybe that's what they mean. Like, can we stop being partisan right now? Sure. Okay. That's something. But politics is like, how do we decide to do stuff together? Can we decide not to do stuff together today because of resurrection? That's kind of, that's a weird message.
Yes, it is.
I've been thinking about like this morning. So every morning during the weekdays, I've been doing online Examine, which is an Ignatian contemplative practice. For those listening in, Ignatius was of Loyola, was a early 16th century dude who developed certain practices largely around discernment. Discernment, not just in the decision-making sense, but we might say discernment of spirits.
Yeah.
What stuff is from
How
God?
do I notice God?
How do I notice God? Where do I experience life or consolation? Where do I experience death or desolation in my actions and in my experiences? And it's a backwards remembering process where you remember how you experienced God, and then it creates a posture for the here and now moving forward about how you maybe begin to notice God in the present, right? This,
Mhm.
and how strange that practice is in a time like this, because before it was easy to have a container for life. Like your day was bracketed by certain activities that maybe for many of us aren't there. And so you'd think there'd be less stuff to discern. But it's no, like our lives are still full with activity. It's just not the same kind of activity. Right. And what constituted a day is different. So like there's this disorientation that's happening. And I'm finding this practice of Examine very helpful for not only creating a sense of rhythm and container for life, but a way of beginning to say, look, I'm disoriented now because the things I used to orient my life around are gone.
Mhm.
And this is a time for contemplative practice and posture, because now I can give attention to what actually is happening. So instead of feeling adrift, I can notice how I'm reacting to things and finding life in the midst of this. But then I can then start making intentional choices about how I live my life, both spiritually and politically. To me, this
Mhm.
is where contemplation becomes powerful.
Well, yeah, and so this is a hugely open moment, right? So we've, all of these structures that, like you were just talking about, we knew how our day was going to go pretty much. We were used to that. It was this habitual pattern. That pattern uh, exercised a lot of tyranny over us and our day, and that's all been blown up, right? So again, contemplation, whereas it ideally is a whole way of life that we were engaged in before this, but certainly at open moments, it's even more powerful because it really helps us to pay attention to all of the different things that are happening. And again, this is not just for those privileged folks who are able to work at home or the people that have to sit at home because they're out of work. But also for people who are having to do business as usual out and about in the midst of this. I mean, that is also an incredible disruption and open moment. And so all of this really leads to this very powerful potential for looking at things in a new and different way.
Mhm.
And
That's right. Yeah.
Kathleen's got a good question.
Yep. I'm going to pop that up here. Kathleen asks, do you think this social isolation will lead us to be self-centered in an unhealthy way?
Mm-hmm. Well, right. I mean, I certainly think that, again, for those people who are able to do the social isolation, right? And we've talked about the fact, and we're going to talk about this a lot more on Wednesday when Greg is with us, but there is this incredible privilege divide, right, between those who are able to do social isolation and those who are not. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that, Kathleen, your question to my mind is kind of this open moment question. Like everything, it's the famous what is it called? Something upset the. It's one of these things in like organizational dynamic games. The fruit basket upset, right? That's kind of a little activity that people do. Yeah, so everything's been thrown into chaos. And a lot of what we're wondering is, how is it going to come back together? And yeah, and we don't know. And I think that there are probably healthy ways it can come back together. And then also there are all kinds of unhealthy ways that it can come back together.
I think there's also this question that comes up in my mind is, what is our go-to response to fear? Like, so some people, when they're afraid, might have a learned habit of connecting with other people. Other people shut down and move inward. And so if our go-to response to fear is to go inward and we're stressed out and afraid during this time, it could definitely develop a sort of self-centeredness in an unhealthy way. All the more reason to be practical and thoughtful about how we develop habits of community.
Right. Yeah.
And we're starting to see whether or not how strong and good those habits maybe have been leading up into this point.
Yeah. So one of the things that we're noticing, I think, as people try to pay attention to what's going on, right, is that you hear a lot of people say, well, I'm actually noticing a lot of good things that are going on right now as a result of this, right? And they almost feel guilty about that, right? Because they say, well, gosh, I feel sort of bad saying that I'm noticing good things when, people are dying and people are unemployed and people are sick, right? So there's all this negative turmoil. But then some people are like, well, some of these changes and some of these things that I'm feeling called to, some of these new ways of being that that are being called out of me, those actually seem positive, right? And again, that's to me this contemplative noticing. Yeah, we notice things that are difficult or death dealing, as Ignatius called it, but then we notice these new things that are life giving. And so the contemplative life encourages us to pay attention to all of that as a way of moving forward in potentially a healthy way.
Have you noticed anything that's been life-giving in particular?
Well, yeah, one of the things that I've really noticed, and I think that we maybe even mentioned this in one of the earliest episodes, is that people want to talk about important things right now. Right? I mean, I'm noticing a lot less trivial conversation. And that's been very life-giving for me because I'm really bad at trivial conversation. So how about them Yankees kind of conversation, it's not my thing. And so yeah, so that's been one thing for sure. The other thing that I would just comment before we get to Ellen's comment here is that suddenly in many institutional settings, particularly the church, but a lot of others that have been totally resistant to change, suddenly people are like, yeah, we got to change stuff and we can do it and we got to make it happen. And I mean, I've joked with a number of pastors about this over the last 3 weeks, that the kinds of changes that they have made in their church would take about 3,000 hours worth of committee meetings over many years and still probably would not happen. And suddenly within a week, they've been able to happen. So Let's get to Ellen here.
And then Zarius has one.
Yeah, and then Zarius has one.
Ellen writes, when as a teen, I was in a door-to-door evangelism group. Woohoo! Fundamentalist. We used to pray we would be put into folks' lives in a moment of openness, meaning that they had recently experienced or were presently going through a traumatic experience. Yes, Dan, this is an open moment. I'm glad you are pointing people to something good rather than the tiny spiel I was trying to deliver back then. And I don't know how I just that emoticon, like, is that disgruntled face? Is it just sad? I can't.
Yeah,
that's scrunchy face.
Scrunchy face.
Yeah, I mean, I've been there. The whole idea of evangelism when I was a camp counselor and speaker was if someone wasn't in a moment of openness, you had to create one by creating a crisis moment. That's the anxious seat, I think, as Charles Finney would call it. And that's kind of crappy, but there is something to it. Like when you're in a crisis, you realize, oh, what was happening before isn't working. I need to do something else.
And of course, I mean, this sort of phenomenon exists at every level of reality, right? I mean, anybody who's read anything about chaos theory, which is the mathematical description of behavior in complex systems, this is what happens with systems, is that they get to a certain point, they're in equilibrium for a while, then they go into disequilibrium, and then there's this moment of chaos, which is where everything kind of dissipates and disappears. And that happens as a bridge to a next stable system. And so, this is what happens in evolution of inanimate and animate systems, energetic systems. And, now we're experiencing this in our own ecological and social systems. And Ellen, I've got a pamphlet for you when we're done with this.
Zarius writes, mental health and emotional healing has been on my radar, especially now. I have used this time to learn therapeutic skills and self-healing skills.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's part of the thing is like we have this, for me, speaking personally, like, okay, I've been thrown for a loop. And so the sort of activities I do, like, I can't do anymore. And so I'm simultaneously, it's been surprising. A lot of people have experienced this too. Like, even though I have less things I'm supposed to do, I feel busy a lot. Because of even just the idea of now I have to prepare 3 meals for my family a day and not rely on going out and driving through or whatever. So there's a lot of that. But it's causing me to reflect like, okay, life is going to go back to normal at some point. We're in a stressful time now. How am I responding? What's my experience of this? So that like when eventually I have to go back to regular life, how am I going to do well at that? So this is causing me to be introspective and prioritizing what's most important.
Well, and just the reality that, and again, this is very common with the contemplative life. I mean, the contemplative life is actually not peaceful and stress-free, right? So, I mean, when you start really deeply paying attention, all your stuff comes up. And when you're doing that in community, everybody's stuff comes up. And you annoy the crap out of each other, and it's really hard to be together sometimes. And so we are experiencing a moment of that. I mean, people are smushed together. There's a huge amount of stress. There's a huge amount of change. And that is mentally taxing on all kinds of levels. Every one of us have noticed we're more tired. I talk to people about that all the time. And this is part of what's going on right now. And so contemplative practice is used as something that then grounds us to help with our well-being in the midst of the transformational process that we are either voluntarily or involuntarily submitting ourselves to.
Well, and it's a way of giving attention to things we might otherwise choose to ignore. So there's so many things in life that cause cognitive dissonance.
Right.
So many conflicts, contradictions. And so generally, I feel like a lot of people have this low level apathy going all the time because they can't deal with these complexities and these contradictions. But contemplation says, no, like if I'm doing contemplative practice, it means I have to lean into cognitive dissonance. That's not
Mm-hmm.
peaceful.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it
Yeah.
leads to peace because it leads to holism and healing. It's peaceful in that sense, but not. It's not a calm experience exactly.
Right. So Kathleen says, throw up her comment about sports there. Yeah, I love it that life in small towns is no longer focused on sports. Yeah, I think that a huge percentage of people, and especially men in America, are probably in crisis right now because they can't talk about sports all the time. And I find it really funny that in response to that, like ESPN is running all these, classic ancient football games and people. And again, that's the thing about our ego habit, right? We cling, we're trying to maintain stability of our ego habit. But again, when we're involved in contemplative practice, we're voluntarily entering into that dissolution of our ego selves. And so that's very much in concert with what's going on right now. All right. Hey, Eric.
Eric, I remember annoying the crap out of community when all my stuff came up. I mean, that's my experience of community was being annoyed with everyone and myself all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because stuff
Yeah.
would come up and you can't,
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't just go somewhere else because we all lived together.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
so when my
What?
stuff would come up.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm just remembering when I was living in and building a monastery, and one of the things that we were doing was installing the plumbing for the heating system after the building had been built. So it involved crawling in these crawl spaces. And anyway, it was an incredible undertaking. But I remember we'd have these buckets and we'd haul all of our plumbing tools, and we'd crawl on our bellies like all the way down under this thing. And I was working with this one guy who, yeah, was at times very annoying to me. And I remember one time taking my bucket, crawling all the way under, only to see that he had removed several of the essential tools that I needed to work under there, which meant I would have to crawl all the way back out. And I was not happy. I was not happy. Say a low moment in terms of my personal behavior when I got out of the crawl space. Oh, all right, Kathleen.
I've been unable to find a grief counselor. All of them on my list are overwhelmed, so I'm going to have to get better at contemplation.
Yeah, I mean this has been an issue in general that something like 3 out of 5 people in our country before this happened could not get the kind of mental health support that they needed. Now it's probably 4.5 out of 5. And so that's a real issue. And again, when we think about how do we want to move forward with this, well, maybe one way of moving forward is that we actually want to focus on caring systems of community where people can engage in contemplation together and also can get the support and help that they need. Like that would be really, really healthy. All right, more
We
good
got
comments.
a few comments coming in. Ellen writes, when I was recovering from being inpatient for a mental health hospitalization, I rebuilt the day-to-day schedule one thing at a time. That sounds so nice, that practice. Creating a foundational structure, sorry for the cheese, is still strong in the storm when you only put good things into your container. We're all in the storm now. Contemplative practice is like the wise person who built his house or schedule on the rock.
Mm-hmm.
There's kind of for a lot of us, a paring away. It's kind of nice. It's like when you like decide like, oh, I hate the way my living room looks. So I'm just going to pull everything out into a big pile and put it back one piece at a time the way I want. It's like one day we woke up and everything was like, everything in our living room was just in a big pile in the middle of the room. That's kind of a little bit what this feels like. And it can be overwhelming, and I don't want to do stuff. But to me, I feel like it's taken me a little while to start getting into, okay, how am I going to layer things back up?
Hmm. Well, and Ellen, your comment about the basic structure and what are the building blocks of the basic structure are super important, right? I mean, then all of the monastic rules, and it's kind of funny to a lot of people when you read these things, right? They're so specific and down to earth, like, where do you put the tools? What time do you do this? How do you pray together? How do you eat together? And they're creating this container. And again, you think about a very powerful physiochemical reaction, and you have to have a strong container to allow that to occur in a way that is not damaging. And so the creating a container, creating that schedule, creating those parameters, that's not rules for rules' sake, although in unhealthy communities it can become that way. But that is so that the chemical, physical, spiritual reaction of contemplation can happen in a way that guides us through to a healthy result, and that's super important. Yeah, hey Medina, she's got a great comment.
A good friend of mine made the comment that we need community to help us see the speck in our own eye. We can never see it on our own. We can see a reflection of it, but it takes others to help us see the speck in our own eye.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that one of my favorite little contemplative teaching images is any idiot can see God in the sunset. It really takes some spiritual maturity to see God in the person that's annoying the heck out of you.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, absolutely. Um, we've got a question.
Ben writes, can you give your opinion on method versus message? I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that, Ben. So if you can maybe say more, that'd be helpful.
Yeah,
But maybe you have a thought, Dan.
yeah. No, I'm not sure exactly what he's getting at. I could make some guesses, but
Mm.
um,
Yeah, we don't want to subject you to our guesses. It's, maybe you can say a little more, and we can.
yeah. But I mean, I do think that I do think that one of the things that is, uh, I mean, that brings up for me, and I don't know whether this is what he's talking about, um, but it's very important to realize that contemplation is a process, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not just a set of answers or teachings, right?
That's right.
So there are teachings, and there are lots of teachings about it, but we need to be engaged with it, right? The practice is the most important part. And so yeah, being engaged with the practice is really at the heart of it. Yeah, right. Ellen says rules are for considering your housemates with love. Yeah,
That's right.
exactly. Yeah, those boundaries and um,
Zeres writes, that is my goal, to learn the mental health and spiritual care skills for my own healing to offer to others. I just facilitated a virtual social hour for a leadership and entrepreneurial cohort I'm a part of. We collectively agreed to have social hour monthly. Yeah.
yeah. Well, and Mark, you asked earlier about what are some of the life-giving things that are happening, and I do think that this is one of them, right? So if I'm not spending a million hours watching sports, uh, maybe I'm spending more hours interacting with people in deeper and meaningful ways. And again, would I rather be doing that in person? Yeah. But one of the things that a lot of people talked about before this all started, right, is that yeah, we'd love to get together for an hour, but to have everybody get in their car, drive through traffic, they've got their kid at home, they're trying to eat a meal, uh, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that becomes impossible. But now people are going like, well, if I go to my room and I hop on video, I can be with people for an hour and there's no extraneous time. And again, I don't think we're going to want to do that all the time for everything after this, but I sure hope we realize that that is actually a very life-giving possibility. Hey, Phyllis, good to see you this morning.
Yeah, it was. So I've been doing this daily examine practice, which to me, I've for years I've tried to have a communal practice of prayer with different people. Even when we were living in an intentional community, and there was like up to 30 of us within a few houses, it was almost impossible.
Mm-hmm.
Like even though that was the perfect situation to create that, but now because of this, like we're doing it via Zoom, which is still, I think it still counts and still works.
Yeah.
There's been a handful of us most mornings. I don't know how long it'll continue. I don't know what will happen after the thing goes away. But in the meantime, it's been kind of nice just to be
Yeah.
able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's like this. I mean, I've been just loving this and love hearing from everybody and you and
Mhm.
I talking and our guests. It's been terrific.
Mhm.
So we are about at the end. And so just want to say a little bit about schedule this week. So we are not broadcasting tomorrow. Wednesday, we are going to have another guest, the Reverend Gregory Bentley. Who's pastor in Huntsville, Alabama, and is also running to be the co-moderator of the National Presbyterian Church. Super cool guy. So I'm really excited that he's coming on. Then we will also be on Thursday and Friday.
Mhm.
And so we really hope that you join us. Maybe we can let Lena have the last word here.
Yeah. Hello, amazing humans and friends.
Hello, Lena.
Hi, Lena. Wondering if you have thoughts and experience on contemplative practice and experiences of trauma. For those who've had different forms of abuse or experiences as a marginalized person of systemic oppression like racism and or sexism, what can contemplative practice offer? What are some challenges? I've been thinking about this in the context of my own life, and it's not been as peaceful as I thought. It's been bringing up quite a bit of anger,
Yeah.
actually.
Well, you know what, Lena, I think that would actually be great as a topic for one of our. Why don't we come back to that later in the week? Because that's not a quick answer. But exactly, when we engage in contemplative practice, all of our stuff comes up. And so how we work with that and how we experience that, I mean, there are detailed sort of specific teachings in terms of the actual practice itself, but then also much more general teachings. But yeah, I mean, that's a very important thing to realize is that, and again, this notion that I'm going to sit down and be quiet and be all peaceful and spiritual is probably the number one erroneous teaching about contemplation, because that is not what happens.
Yeah.
So thanks for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, make this a whole episode. Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
So we will do that.
And I have thoughts about it because I've experienced trauma, and it was
Yep.
hard for me to get into contemplation because
Yep.
because of that. So
Yep.
we'll, maybe we'll do that on, Thursday or Friday. I guess we'll
Yeah.
schedule it and go from there.
Yeah. Sounds great.
Yeah.
Good. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for coming and watching. And this has been great. And we still have snow outside.
Yeah.
So
I'm hoping to walk through that today because I want to say goodbye to my snowy friends.
yes.
And
All right.
we'll see y'all on Wednesday. Hopefully some of you can make it.
Bye.